Hello and welcome to the Civil War Project. My name is Carrie, and whether you're a history buff or a novice, I invite you to join me as I retrace Civil War history one person, place, and event at a time. The place I'm going to talk about today holds a very significant place in my soul, the Lincoln Home National Historic Site in Springfield, Illinois. On a cold winter day in March 1979, I was almost 3 years old and living in Springfield. We had relatives visiting from out of town, so we went to see two historical places, the first one being the Lincoln Home. If you ever wondered how early you could get a kid interested in something, I am living proof that it can start young, because it was this day that lit the fuse of my self-motivated journey to learn all I could about Abraham Lincoln and the multitude of other people who lived during the Civil War. Therefore, I felt it made sense to have my first spotlight video on a place that inspired me to learn and to see as much of our history as possible. Because I'm a new YouTuber, I have some time restrictions until I can gain an audience, so this video will be in two parts. The first video will set the stage, starting with some historical background on Illinois, Springfield, and Abraham Lincoln. I want to give you not just a better understanding of Abraham, his family, and the house, but also the town and state they resided in, because that would have had an influence in their lives. In part 2 of this series, I'll get into the history of the house, and we'll talk about the lives of the Lincoln family during their time there, so you can envision how they interacted with each other in their home. I'll then share my favorite features about the site, and we'll wrap up with what you need to know for your future visit. And if you're unable to make the journey anytime soon, I'll also talk about how you can virtually tour the home, which is something I would have absolutely loved to have had access to as a kid. So let's talk history. For hundreds of years in the Mississippi River Valley, there lived the Illinois, which consisted of about a dozen indigenous tribes. Their name translates to the best people. France was the first European country to claim title over the Illinois land in the mid-1600s, and using their own French translation of the name called it Illinois. It's that French pronunciation from the 1600s that we continue to use today, and it's why the S at the end of Illinois is silent. Unfortunately for the Illinois, by the early 1800s, their population in Illinois had been reduced to around 500. In 1832, the remaining Illinois would be moved to a reservation in Kansas after President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. Another thing the French introduced into the territory was implementation of their slave laws, which brought enslaved peoples into the region. Many worked in salt mines, which was the first major industry in this territory, but they also built structures and performed other manual labor tasks. Even though the territory would exchange hands a few times, first to the British and then under the umbrella of the new United States of America, new laws were made in the late 1700s to forbid slavery, and yet ways were found around them. The most common was the introduction of indentured servant contracts that bound people to work for a certain number of years in return for food and shelter. That might sound like an improvement, but the contracts could be for up to 99 years. Even in modern times, very few people lived to be 99, so this was still slavery, just under a different name that was legally permitted. In 1818, Illinois officially joined the United States as the 21st state. Congress was having a difficult time with slavery as the country continued to grow and more areas wanted to become states. This was before several compromises were legally made in the upcoming decades leading up to the Civil War. Unofficially, the idea was to balance the number of free states and slave states. Slave states allowed the horrific institution of slavery to remain legal. Free states, in theory, were states where slavery was not legally allowed. Because Mississippi had been admitted as a slave state a year before, and Alabama would also be admitted as a slave state a few weeks after Illinois, Illinois had to be admitted as a free state in order to keep the perceived balance of power. The reality is that the 1818 Illinois Constitution allowed for the continued use of indentured servant contracts. It also allowed for a certain number of enslavers to retain their enslaved persons for continued work in the salt mines. In the first General Assembly in 1819, the first black laws were passed, largely designed to deny African Americans basic rights of citizenship. They discouraged freedom seekers, or even free African Americans, from coming to the state. These black laws even made it legal for enslaved persons and indentured servants who were identified as disobedient or who were perceived to be not working hard enough, or if they were caught trying to organize, to receive punishment, up to 39 lashes. In 1829, new laws meant that free African Americans not only had to produce a certificate of freedom in excellent condition, even a small tear could make the document void, but they also had to pay $1,000 as assurance that they would follow the laws and not become a burden on the county. That equates to $32,000 today. It would take until 1848 for the Illinois Constitution to finally be updated and for slavery and indentured servitude to no longer be legal. However, in 1853, the state issued new black laws, largely in response to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act approved by the U.S. Congress, requiring enslaved persons to be returned to their owners if found in a free state. These new black laws were considered the harshest of any northern state. If any African American entered Illinois and stayed beyond 10 days, they would face a misdemeanor and large fines. If the fines could not be paid, the county sheriff could sell the individual's labor, turning the individual into a slave. These black codes would remain in place until the end of the Civil War in 1865. I say this because during Abraham Lincoln's life, slavery was one of the biggest topics of the day. I've often read how Abraham's only contact with the horrific institution of slavery was when he was in New Orleans, Louisiana on a job and witnessed a slave auction. However, there were men in Springfield and all across Illinois who had enslaved persons and who had indentured servants, and Lincoln knew some of these men and had interactions with them, given their high status and his occupation as a lawyer. Now, there were several notable abolitionists in Illinois during Abraham's time there, and there was an underground railroad to help bring enslaved peoples to freedom and safety as early as 1786. Those things would have impacted Abraham's views as well. He never supported the institution of slavery, and that would become a big part of his political speeches as he eventually ascended to the White House. Now, in 1818, most of the Illinois population resided in the southern third of the state. Early settlers didn't know what to make of this vast, treeless prairie to the north. They assumed that because there was a lack of trees there, that it meant that the land wouldn't be suitable for farming. It also meant that settlers wouldn't have the wood they would need to build their homes, furniture, tools, and other necessary items. For example, even a modest 16-foot by 20-foot, one-room log cabin, similar to what Abraham Lincoln spent his childhood in, would take 50 to 60 trees alone. For this reason, most people initially settled in the southern portion of the state, near or along its many rivers and streams, which were lined with those all-important trees. Illinois' first two capital cities, Kaskaskia, followed by Vandalia, were also in that same southern region. As for Springfield, in early 1819, a man named John Kelly built his cabin on what is now the corner of 2nd and Jefferson Streets. Several families, including John Kelly's parents, siblings, and their families, came from North Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia, and settled along a small clear stream that emptied into Spring Creek. It was this creek that the eventual town of Springfield would be named after. One of Springfield's earliest settlers included a 5-year-old enslaved boy named Jack. He would eventually be sold to another family, who then moved to the newly formed slave state of Missouri. By the late 1830s, Springfield's population was around 3,000. It was centrally located in Sangamon County, which was named for the Sangamon River that runs through it. There were stores, banks, tailors, and churches. There were also lawyers, as Springfield was the county seat. So now that you know a little bit of background about Illinois and Springfield, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is best known for being our 16th president, who led the country during a civil war and was assassinated just as that war was coming to a close. He grew up in rural, one-room log cabins in central Kentucky and southern Indiana, and his formal education amounted to less than a year. Abraham once summed up his childhood as the short and simple annals of the poor. His mother would die from illness when he was 9, leaving behind Abraham and his older sister Sarah. His father would remarry a widow with 3 children, and the two families were merged. Luckily, Abraham got along very well with his new stepmother. But he was still forced to provide labor for others starting in a very young age. All wages he earned would go to his father, which would help to provide for the entire family. In 1830, at the age of 21, he moved with his father and stepmother to central Illinois. He would set out on his own a year later at the age of 22, which is when he was legally allowed to keep wages earned for himself. As he entered this new stage of his life, he described himself as a strange, friendless, uneducated, penniless boy. Abraham spent the next 6 years in New Salem, Illinois, a small village 20 miles northwest of Springfield. He worked multiple jobs, often several at a time, such as surveyor and postmaster, and he unsuccessfully co-owned a general store, which also caused him a great deal of debt that would take him many years to pay off. In his free time, he started to self-study the law by borrowing law books from a lawyer in nearby Springfield. With his honesty, hard work, and great storytelling abilities, Abraham became a very well-liked figure in New Salem and really the region. Though he failed at his first attempt, his second attempt to be elected as a member of the Illinois State House of Representatives was successful at age 25. At this point, Abraham was a member of the Whig Party, which was one of two main political parties at the time, and was also the primary conservative party from the 1830s to the 1850s. While in his second term at the State House, Abraham was part of a group of Whig Party men called the Long Nine, due to their collective average height of 6 feet, which at the time was above the average height of a typical adult male. The state was seeing increasing population growth and expansion in northern Illinois because, as it turned out, the land was spectacular for farming. So, the Long Nine were successful in their bid to permanently move the state capital 72 miles north from Vandalia to a more centralized Springfield in 1837. For those who might wonder why Chicago was not considered or chosen, its geography is so far northeast that it didn't really meet the ideal qualification of being centralized. In addition, Chicago was officially granted a city charter by the state also in 1837, so those two issues just didn't make it a feasible option. Abraham would move to Springfield that same year, largely because the town of New Salem was quickly dwindling in population due to its lack of access to major transportation routes. All the self-studying in between jobs paid off, and Abraham was able to obtain a license to practice law. He became a junior partner in a local law firm and set up living arrangements as a boarder above a store owned by Joshua Speed, who would become one of his lifelong best friends. Still, he initially found Springfield's social scene daunting, writing, "This thing of living in Springfield is rather a dull business. I am quite as lonesome here as I ever was anywhere in my life." In the fall of 1839, Abraham met Mary Todd, a cheerful, energetic, and intelligent woman from a prominent, wealthy, and slave-owning family in Lexington, Kentucky, who was 10 years his junior. Mary came to Springfield to live with her oldest sister, Elizabeth, who was married to a prominent Illinois legislator and lawyer. They were also a big part of the Springfield social scene, which is a key reason why Mary moved there, to find a suitable husband. At a dance, Abraham saw Mary and worked up the courage to tell her that he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. Mary is said to have later told friends that he did just that, dance with her in the worst way. I can imagine it would have been very awkward simply by their height difference, the 6'4" Abraham towering over the 5'2" Mary. But she was still very taken with Abraham, and he was still very taken with her. Now, being very like-minded in their politics, Abraham and Mary became fast friends. They could talk together for hours and wrote letters to each other. They also found a shared experience through loss, as they had both lost their mothers when they were still young children. For many, though, these two seemed a very odd and wrongly matched pair. Personality-wise, and even in their childhood backgrounds, with Mary growing up in wealth and privilege, and Abraham growing up in poverty and still being poor in his adult life, they were largely opposites. For 3 years, they courted on and off, but eventually they married at Elizabeth's home on the evening of November 4th, 1842, by Reverend Charles Dresser, an Episcopal minister. Remember his name for a moment, because there is more to this story. This is the end of part 1. Please like, subscribe, and then head over to part 2, where I talk more about the home, the Lincoln's time there, visitor tips and suggestions, as well as those virtual online links. I'll see you there.